Welcome to our second day of Raven Respite. I'm Abigail Almajola. I'm a director at the Raven Group and co-host of For the Win podcast. Over the past 4 years, at the federal and state level, we've witnessed ongoing attacks on the provision of and access to healthcare for everyone, and that includes reproductive healthcare services. Basic sexual and reproductive healthcare services have become one of the most divisive issues of our time. And so, what better person to speak with this morning on this topic than Alexis McGill Johnson, who became the new president and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America and Planned Parenthood Action Fund just this year in June 2020. And prior to June, she served as acting president and CEO and was part of the leadership of both organizations for the better part of the decade. Alexis is a social and racial justice leader. She's a lifelong political and cultural organizer. And so I am so thrilled to be speaking with you today, Alexis.
Oh, it's so great to be here, Abby. Thank you.
So Planned Parenthood, the largest provider for sexual health care. There are over 600 health centers across the nation. So what does leadership of such a large entity, an organization of this stature, look like in this time in history?
Yeah. So, I mean, in this time in history where, as you said, I've been a part of the organization for the better part of a decade. And so we have been, fighting attacks around access to basic sexual and reproductive health for all of that time and even longer. But this past year, we have gone through, not just more attacks. We're also in the middle of a pandemic. We are also in the middle of a really important reckoning around racial justice, and in the middle of obviously a major election, as we know. And so, this time, thinking about just the impact of all of the confluence of all of those events, and thinking how to really support our affiliate health centers who are working so hard to provide care in the midst of all of this, how to support our staff who are fighting to provide that healthcare, and yet also, dealing with the trauma of the racial justice. Those are the sorts of things that have been at the top of my mind as we watch this administration over and over again push policies that just undermine the very access to sexual and reproductive health care, undercut the health safety net, and really devastate largely, the impact, as we know, as we've seen through COVID, the impact has been largely on Black and brown rural communities. And so, so the time, it's hard to say, to describe what it's like to lead unless we put all of those pieces of what the time looks like for sexual and reproductive health. But I'm inspired by the teams. I'm inspired by the staff and how they show up every day.
Right. And everything you just described, it is, we're compounding trauma upon trauma, struggle upon struggle. And I'm thinking a lot about your particular leadership, right? You are the second Black woman to lead Planned Parenthood. And wondering how all of this feels, right? How does being a Black woman affect that experience?
I think it is, it's just a point of humility for me to know that I'm standing on the shoulders of so many Black women, as we, all talked about yesterday during the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, how many Black women were standing and supporting suffrage and still being told to be at the back of the line. I'm standing on the shoulders of Faye Waddleton, who was the first Black president after Margaret Sanger, and first Black president. And, really thinking about kind of what does it mean for me as a leader to show up in the Federation and show up in the movement, and how to do it in a way where the more free I can be, the more unapologetic I can be about how we serve our patients and the healthcare that we provide to many communities that look like us. I know that by doing that, I am freeing the teams around me, the amazing Planned Parenthood staff and leaders around me, to do the same. And so I think it's really important from a leadership perspective to really think about what, we always talk about representation is critical, and, kind of reflecting the world that we live in is really critical. But there's a practice to how we represent and how we show up in a way that really does unleash the freedom and the really the ability to be completely authentic in your own work. And so, that's for me, that is the nexus of my leadership, style. I also think that the work that I'd done prior to stepping into this role, but simultaneously as a board leader, has really been around kind of understanding race equity and building models around inclusion and understanding bias and anxiety. And so, as an organization like Planned Parenthood, which is 104 years old, certainly steeped in, a culture of white supremacy, as 100-year institutions are wont to do.
Right.
It really is important to sit in this position and force an internal reckoning and figure out the kind of work that we need to do across the Federation in support of the movement, in support of so many of our leaders, our RJ leaders who've been holding us accountable or been calling us to question over the last 25 years. And this is work that we need to do right now. So, I feel incredibly humbled and privileged to be able to do it. And honestly, when I look at the brown faces on staff and I say, how can I show up so that they can show up and be free like that? If I can do that, then I feel like it's a good thing.
And this really sounds like transformative leadership. And I like what you said about being unapologetic, because I think, particularly when it comes to talking about abortion, right? There's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of shame that people try to put on people who need the service. And so thinking through how Planned Parenthood provides so many different services, right? So it's abortion, it's contraception, it's HPV vaccination. Like, I could go on and on and on. But really what it comes down to is that because, abortion has been stigmatized, because it's been politicized, right? Above all else, then people often don't think to connect the two: abortion services, all the other services that Planned Parenthood provides. And so they often can't tell that, as we're losing access to abortion rights, we're also losing access to other things. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to the federal attacks, particularly related to Title X, and how that actually plays out for Planned Parenthood and healthcare providers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so critically important what you said in terms of just starting with this notion of stigma and the politicization, the kind of use of stigma to further that politicization, right? Planned Parenthood is first and foremost a healthcare provider. The care that we provide is under attack and has been politicized. And so we've had to actually, ensure that we are both driving conversations around what the panoply of sexual and reproductive health care is. That includes the STI screenings, includes the cancer screenings, it includes the, access to family planning, birth control, gender affirming care. And it also includes access to abortion, because abortion is healthcare. And what we've seen particularly over the last decade, which I can speak to kind of more clearly as having been involved as a board leader, is, we've seen during the 2010 Congress, when there was the census led into a tremendous amount of gerrymandering and control over state legislatures across the country, at a time where abortion has consistently been, 77% of Americans support access to Roe, and or believe Roe should be the law of the land. And yet, in state by state, we started to see where a vocal minority of folks who oppose that basically got the levers of power. Right. And so you see it kind of from a structural standpoint. It doesn't just impact abortion. This is also where we saw, stand your ground laws flourish, where we saw restrictions on voting flourish, where we've seen, states who, the same states who decided not to expand Medicaid under ACA are all of these same states. And so you end up essentially in a tale of two cities, where you have, some states like California, where our affiliate is opening up, well-being centers that are giving trusted information from healthcare providers inside of high schools. Literally walking down from algebra class, and you can see your nurse practitioner and have a conversation and an STI screening if you need it. Right. And then you have a state like Missouri where the state health commissioner is actually tracking the periods of Planned Parenthood patients to figure out whether or not they were terminating their pregnancies and what was happening. And so like you see the ability for, creating freedom and then abuse of power. And I think that there's no state in the union that where there's not support for access to abortion, right? There's literally no state where even the states that I mentioned, and yet what we see is this, essentially these levers being controlled by folks. When you layer on what's happened during this Trump administration, right, where we've seen Planned Parenthood was forced out of Title X, which is the family's largest the nation's largest family planning program because of the domestic gag rule, which basically said our providers could not refer patients to abortion if they found out they were pregnant, and requested information. We've seen over 200 judges being confirmed by Mitch McConnell. Incredibly conservative judges that have been very anti-women's health, some of whom actually don't even believe in IVF, like much less abortion. They don't actually even support IVF. We're obviously, looking at a Supreme Court that, where all of these issues are hanging in the balance. We are, praying over RBG. We've seen, but we have seen, Trump's appointees do exactly what he anticipated they would do or expected them to do. And so, we're about 15 cases that are one step away that would, if not overturn, or would severely undermine our ability to access abortion. So, we're at a critical moment. I know there's a lot of questions as to whether or not abortion is on the ballot this year. It is so critical that we are engaging in this conversation today because, for many of us, we've taken this right for granted, right? We grew up in a generation, I'm as old as Roe. So like, I've never lived in a world where where access to abortion didn't exist, even though it is harder for some, obviously, than others. There are significant barriers, but that's the reality of what we're living in, and that's the huge challenge that we're facing.
Yeah, and I do want to come back to you just listed the ground that we've lost. It feels like, right, in the states, and various different ways, not just on reproductive healthcare, but. I do want to come back to that, but I also want to talk a little bit more specifically. You started hinting at this, right? But more specifically about like who is really harmed by this, right? Who are the types of people we're talking about?
Well, I mean, wealthy people have always had access to abortion, right? They'd fly to Europe, they'd fly to Puerto Rico, they would, fly to, in some cases, Kansas, some of the more independent states in the union, to access abortion. And we know that just with this most recent Supreme Court case that was decided in June, the June medical case, that that if that law were allowed to stand and kind of flourished across the country, and if Roe is overturned, kind of, those state bans start to get enacted across the country, 25 million women of reproductive age would lose access to abortion. Those are going to be largely Black and Brown communities, largely low-income communities, largely rural communities, folks who, literally we saw in the pandemic, right? And during COVID, those early days in COVID, when governors were enacting those executive orders and saying that abortion was elective and non-essential and not time sensitive, right? I mean, get your head around that. We saw people get in their cars and drive 16 hours. Yeah. They would put their, children in the car, their elderly parents. They would drive 16 hours from Texas to Colorado, Texas to California, some cases getting on planes in the middle of the pandemic when we were supposed to be sheltering in place. In many cases, just for medication abortion, right? Not a procedure that requires PPE, not something that, that should be, that we shouldn't be able to fulfill if someone is requesting that. Those were largely low income folks who who had made a decision about their own bodies and about their own lives, and the states that they were living in stepped in and said, no, you may even be an essential worker, but you don't have control over your own body.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about. Those are going to be the communities that are most impacted.
Yeah. Yeah. And so to go back to, the legislation right. We're talking about voting, right?
Yes.
The people we've elected now, who in 2010, who are now drafting these laws, passing this legislation, restricting access, closing down clinics, closing down clinics that provide other services in addition to abortion, testing, the screening, all of that. I think I can't help but be quite concerned that we are losing so much ground, and we've lost so much ground as Democrats or progressives. And so I'm wondering, who can we rely on, right? Or what's the problem, right? What is the problem? Because it's not that Planned Parenthood hasn't been out here. It's not that other large healthcare providers or other or reproductive justice organizations. It's not like organizers aren't out there pushing out these messages. So, what is like the one thing that you would say, if there's one thing, right? Like that's a hard question, but what's the one thing that we can think about as we're trying to gain back some ground, as we're trying to push society in a more progressive way?
Yeah, and I think it's we're definitely painting the dystopian Handmaid's Tale around what's happening. And I think for many of, when you really get down to the ground, a lot of that is for sure happening. I don't want to undermine the strength of what's also happening right now too. And, the one thing is vote. One thing is vote in November, and ensure up and down the ballot that we are electing reproductive health champions, starting with the top of the ticket, because we know Biden and Harris will be incredibly strong on these issues, and particularly Senator Harris, who some very innovative ideas around literally modeling protection of reproductive rights after protection of voting rights. And there are proven ways in which we can actually stave some of this and think about some federal legislative strategies to ensure that the states don't get involved in some of this trickery. There have been a number of restrictions that have been placed over the years in the states. I think even last year, it's like somewhere upwards of like 300 just last year. And those bans have done everything from like question the safety of abortion, which is an incredibly safe procedure, one of the safest medical procedures. They have stigmatized providers by adding a whole layer of restrictions around abortion providers that don't exist on any other medical providers. And then they've begun to in many ways, they continue to stigmatize the patients who are seeking access to abortion, stigmatizing their choices and their control over their bodies, and criminalizing everything from pregnancy to miscarriage. And so I think, you raised earlier this point around stigma that undergirds so much of these conversations. And it's a stigma not just about abortion. There's a stigma around sexuality, right? There's a stigma around kind of how we are raised to even understand and own our own bodies, that is just the core of our freedom. Like you cannot have self-determination if you don't control your body. And so, I think that, the two things I would offer would be the vote. And the second, think about what is the work that we need to do to really transform the stigma of what it means to own our bodies proudly, to own our sexuality proudly, and do it in a way that really also helps us understand, what do we need for our bodies to be free? What are the services? What is the care that we need for our bodies to actually, for us to live, healthy, free sexual lives? And I think that, without being able to have that conversation, that, I know I didn't necessarily have with my mom. I know my mom didn't have with her mom. Right. What are we doing to actually have a conversation, with our generation and beyond, around what it really means at this point, and how it actually is a core part of healthcare, right? Yeah. Our sexual being is a very important part of our own healthcare.
Right. You were so correct. And I'm thinking too, I haven't had that conversation with my mom. I've been on this earth 30 years and we have never talked about this. But I'm gonna, before we pivot to questions from the audience, and so folks who are viewing on YouTube and Facebook, please send in your questions. Before we pivot to that, I did want to ask, you started talking about being free in your sexuality. So I'd be remiss not to ask about the summer's most popular song, WAP by Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion. And I think we were talking earlier, and I was saying, we've talked with reproductive justice leaders about how to engage more with these type of cultural moments, right? Because I think that song there's so many things we can talk about related to sexual health and reproductive rights in that song. And so, I mean, I don't need to ask you how you feel about the song, but you can tell us how you feel about it.
I'm like literally on repeat.
My favorite from it.
I love it because it's just emboldened sexuality, as a core part of who we are, and particularly as women, our value and worth has, when you think about just kind of hierarchy of human values, always been reduced to things that we'd have to suppress sexuality in order to be taken seriously, or we'd be too sexual and we wouldn't be, people wouldn't think we were competent about XYZ to lead. And so I just think being able to embrace all sides and really think about all of the ways in which we are powerful, in which we own our bodies and ourselves, and we get to define it, we get to own that. To me, that's what's coming through in that record, and as well, it should be number one, because have you seen the video?
I don't know who hasn't. Even conservatives.
Mentality alone, like determined that should be,
Even conservatives, I think conservatives were the highest viewers on that video. Actually, they were quite upset. But
death protest too much, I'm sure.
Right. So I'm also wondering about messengers then, like who should we be, or what messaging should we be using, and what messengers should we be looking to start bridging the gap?
I honestly, I think particularly in this moment where it's the level of dehumanization that we have seen on every issue that most of us and I'm sure most of your viewers care about is so palpable, and so it's just so heartbreaking that I think centering these conversations around reproductive rights in a framework of freedom, and understanding that freedom, not just to control your own bodies, is the platform to actually allow your imagination to flourish, right? Because when you can make decisions about when and when to parent, when you can make decisions about what identity best expresses, yourself, when you can make decisions about how to have healthy sexual conversations with your partners and inform that kind of, foundation to any relationship, that trust, that respect, those are the sorts of ways in which you're actually giving yourself the freedom, the permission to imagine a world different than the one that you're having. So I think freedom is what we are talking about. I think it is highly correlated to justice, but very different. I think that the justice, a lot of what we've been doing in terms of fighting for justice is restoring us to a point where we can actually think about freedom. And so thinking about how we actually embed those freedom-based conversations in and really center them around imagination. I keep saying Planned Parenthood, we're an imagination dealer. That's what we need to be able to do, is just provide the bedrock, the opportunity for people to imagine who they want to be. Yeah,
that's amazing. So we will go to audience questions now. I believe we have a question around COVID. So from Trish, thank you for your question, Trish. Hi, I would love to hear about how Planned Parenthood is coping with COVID and how it's impacted care.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we had, like everyone else, our health centers, staff were, many of them had to shelter in place because they had their own kind of childcare, challenges or caregiving challenges, or their own physical challenges related to COVID. But the great majority of them, understood that they were essential workers at a time where sexual and reproductive health care had to, was not going to, the need was not going to stop, right? People, even in the middle of the pandemic, people were still having sex. And in fact, we saw an increase in STI screenings. We saw an increase in, in domestic violence and other issues. And so Planned Parenthood health center workers have been there on the front line. They have been there, fighting for access to PPE, in a state by state, knowing that, the national coordination was anything but coordinated.
Mm-hmm.
And they have been showing up every day to care for their patients. In many cases, they've also been able to provide testing for COVID. And when the COVID tests weren't readily available, they were able to test for things like flu or strep, so that we could save those precious tests for, we could just save the precious tests as they were starting to develop. The Planned Parenthood has certainly been impacted, as we all have, and certainly in the wear and tear of us kind of just grappling with what it means to be in a pandemic, but still continuing to show up and serve patients.
So we have another question. Actually, quite a few questions are coming in now. From Elizabeth. I'd love to hear more about what PPFA is doing to support and protect trans and gender nonconforming people, especially as attacks on trans communities continue and intensify in 2020.
Oh, that's a great question, and is so critical. We have, our framework for supporting all issues is really thinking about is centering our patients, right? So we know that our patients are living at an intersection of injustice, not just limited access to abortion and reproductive health care. They are also living at the margins around attacks around trans care, attacks around policing, racial justice and violence. And so, and particularly sometimes the intersection of those, right? Thinking about just, we talk a lot about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We haven't talked as much about Tony McDade, the same period. Mm-hmm. And so our advocacy continues to be to support, to ensure that we are fighting for policies that include, trans care and health insurance coverage, everything from that to really ramping up our telehealth services during the COVID period, which allowed us to actually reach more population, particularly in remote and rural areas, trans folks, and bring them into community once we started getting into Zoom. Young trans teenagers who had not been able to get in a car and drive a couple hours to a local health center are now finding community and really centering around identity. And then in our health centers, the trans care, the gender affirming care that is being provided. And I think in large part because Planned Parenthood really centers itself on being non-judgmental and a trusted care provider has been critical. But we intersect that care with every policy that we need to use to support that access to care, whether that's infrastructure like telehealth or making sure that we're doing everything that we can from employer discrimination to insurance discrimination.
That's great. And then we have a question around leadership, an essential leadership message. So thank you, George. What's the essential leadership message you are embracing during this really tough time?
Honestly, I think it's been really important to be and to demonstrate, as I mentioned, both being vulnerable, right? Because we're all vulnerable right now and it's hard, and to be able to acknowledge that we are living through multiple crises all at once, and we're all carrying a lot of weight, and again, giving people that permission to get off Zoom, to take those mental health breaks, to practice self-care, and to find other ways to engage in community, I think has been really important. And the other piece of it is really just how, again, the more that I can show up being as unapologetic as who I am as a Black woman, about what it has taken for me to, to be here and navigate a largely white organization, and to, show up in a way where I'm practicing freedom, right? Because some of us don't know what freedom feels like, much less looks like in daily practice. The more I can do that, the more I feel like I can, free or support the freedom and the level of unapologeticness of our team and our staff.
That's great. And then one last question, since we're at time. We have a question around any explicit strategy from Joanne. Any explicit strategy Planned Parenthood has to engage people of faith in a reframing of reproductive rights in this country?
That is such a great question, and I really appreciate that, and a great one to end on. We do. We've been, since 1994, Planned Parenthood Federation has had a clergy advocacy board, and we've worked with leaders across multiple faiths, from Church of Christ, Baptist, the Union of Reformed Judaism, like just bringing folks together to really focus on how we can increase kind of public awareness around theology and the intersection of theology and reproductive health. And so that CAB, as we call it, has been an essential group of dedicated clergy and advisors and faith leaders who really kind of are also helping us navigate from a messaging standpoint and messenger standpoint why control over our bodies is actually not inconsistent with how we practice our faith and our choices. And so, as a woman of faith myself, I feel like it's been a really important kind of centering practice to be able to call on our clergy and to, who really are in community and understand that as people grapple with sexual and reproductive health, and they understand the kind of layers of stigma that have been placed largely on our communities, that they're able to thread that needle. So that faith outreach is so critical. It should be way more front and center. And that's work that we continue to do.
Well, thank you so much, Alexis, for joining Rabin Respite, for chatting with me, for all your incredible work and leadership. It is such an honor to see you at the top of Planned Parenthood, and I know we'll see lots of good things. And so I'd also like to thank our audience as well. You all, so this is Rabin Respite, and so we welcome you to join us in taking respite at the art exhibit that we've created specifically for this week, the Democratic National Convention and Rabin Respite. You can visit this art exhibit, this virtual art exhibit, of course, at rabinrespite.com/art-exhibit. And we welcome you to tune in throughout the rest of the day and throughout tomorrow to the rest of our conversations with incredible thought leaders like Alexis. And visit rabinrespite.com to learn more. Thanks, everyone.